So I'm Jacqui Scott. I'm Chief Executive of Hampshire and Isle of Wight Community Foundation, and I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview about what we do and who we are, because we often find that our audiences don't know who we are, and yet they also discover that they may have had funding from us, or that somebody they know or an organisation they're involved with might have been funded by us. I want to give you a little bit of information about the support we've provided within the New Forest District Council area. We go by local authority area, and tell you a little bit about how companies work with us, and obviously give you lots of space for questions. I'm going to reassure you from the get-go, I'm not here to ask you for money, but we'll talk about money. We have a very unusual model. So from my point of view as a leader of a charity, it's quite nice to go in and reassure people that we're not asking for money. But it's not to say we're not going to talk about it. So Hampshire and Isle of Wight Community Foundation are one of 47 community foundations around the country. So we're a network of funders. We're each independent registered charities in our own right. So we, like every other charity, have our own board of trustees and so on. And our focus, so around the country, there is pretty much a community foundation for every inch of the country. So there's one next door in Surrey, Somerset, Dorset, and so on and so on. So the community foundation network really covers the whole of the country. And in fact, in terms of being charitable grant makers, I think we're the second largest charitable grant maker when you combine all of the grant making that we do around the country for the UK. And so we're place-based, by which I mean all community foundations are place-based. All we really mean by that is that we're focused on a very specific geography, and very often we're focused on a smaller geography within that, depending on the original source of the funding that we're utilising. And so effectively what we do is we link donors of all natures. Could be government, could be local authority, could be an individual, could be a company, could in fact be another charity. We link donors to the charitable causes locally, very often the ones that are not well known and not well recognised in the wider community. So they can be local, hyper-local causes. They can have a very specific niche. It could be for a particular health condition, for example. And so it's generally very small local charitable causes that we're working with, and we link donors and potential donors to them. And what we're doing for the donor is giving, the donor will often come to us saying, we've got this idea, we want to do this funding because we think financial resilience is really important with our communities, for example. And we'll go out and we'll find the small local charities that are working on financial resilience with their local clients. And so we do all of the hard work to make sure that the grant making that a particular donor wants to see happen is done with good professional expertise, that there's good checks and balances and so on. But fundamentally, we're linking a donor who knows what they want to achieve with the money with the kinds of community groups that can help them achieve it. As I mentioned, we prioritise supporting small local grassroots organisations. In fact, most organisations funded through Hampshire and Isle of Wight Community Foundation would have an annual turnover of less than £1 million, very often very much less than that. And essentially underpinning everything is our core purpose to address poverty, disadvantage and inequality in our communities. So we are really trying to target the work that is done for the most disadvantaged people in our communities. And last year we made around £1.5 million worth of funding in our region. That's Hampshire, including Southampton and Portsmouth, and the Isle of Wight. And underpinning everything that we do is an endowment fund of £15 million. You may be familiar with the concept, but I will say, in case you're not, think of Oxford, Eton and so on, who were founded by endowment funds. So we have £15 million that we've raised over the last 20 years. And that money is invested. We get good returns from the investment markets, and we make or about half of our grant making every year comes from the endowment funds, and it's the proceeds that we've achieved through the investments. So obviously it can be up and down, but generally it is up. And so we've got about 15 million quid in endowments. So we don't touch the capital there. Very quickly, we're a team of 8, almost all part-time, apart from myself and one other. And Joanne, Lucy, and I are the people that funders are most likely to work with if they're looking at making a grant or funding work in their local community. I think my job title is what it says on the tin, which means Jack of all trades and master of none really, I think. Lucy is our philanthropy manager and Joanne is our grants manager. So Joanne is mainly facing the community groups and Lucy is mainly facing donors and potential donors. I'm not going to go into great detail on the impact themes, but just so that you can get a picture of it, everything that we fund is categorized under a specific impact theme, and that helps us be able to talk more effectively about the change that we're helping enable in our local communities. And the golden thread, as we like to describe it, that runs through everything we do is poverty and inequality. So that's about making sure that the support that we're funding is really addressing poverty and inequality, either alleviating either of those issues or helping address the underpinning causes, depending on what the particular type of activity we're funding is. So I just want to give you a little bit of a picture of the support we've been providing to the New Forest. And it's quite interesting at the moment because we've been funding around about a quarter to a third of, well, around about a quarter of our funding, a little bit less, going into the New Forest every year for the past couple of years. And that's going to be carrying on for a year or two more. And we all live in the New Forest. You could argue that Portsmouth or Southampton have more poverty and inequality, or the island has more poverty and inequality. And that's, we can pick apart the statistics on that kind of thing. There is significant, really significant poverty, inequality and disadvantage, deprivation within the New Forest area. And there's quite a strong argument for the need to support people who are living in what are ostensibly wealthier areas if they are poor. So actually, you'll all be familiar with this because it's a really nice, easy way for me to explain it. Leamington, I live in Leamington. The main supermarket is Waitrose. Of course, we've got the 2 Tesco's and the, can never remember if it's Aldi down the bottom of the hill, Asda down the bottom of the hill. But the main supermarket is a Waitrose. And if you are on benefits or working as a care worker on minimum wage or something close to it, you're very likely to have a very much lower wage than Waitrose's target audience, but you are still facing the same cost, and it's more difficult for you if you don't have a car. You can't necessarily afford a taxi to go over to New Milton for the Tesco, for the big Tesco. And if anybody has compared prices, I reckon they're about the same in Tesco on the high street as it is at Waitrose. So living within a wealthier area, if you are poor, can have many layers of disadvantage that make it conceivably more difficult to live within that area. So that's kind of to give a picture of why we would consider supporting an area like this quite significantly. The other side of it is because we have significant funding to enable that at the moment. If you are a Leamington local, you might have heard of Charles Burnett. Charles died a few years ago now in a helicopter accident, very suddenly, obviously. And he left a considerable estate behind. And through that estate, we have been given a significantly large amount of money to invest into the New Forest area to support the local communities here. So I'll give you a couple of examples of the sort of things that we have been funding. So these are a mix of funding that has been made through the Charles Burnett legacy and other funds as well, because it's not the only source of the funding for the New Forest area. So Handy Trust, some of you may know them, based over in Hythe. They received a small grant from us a couple of years ago, £10,000, or a reasonable grant, but just under £10,000. And they reached over 1,000 young people through that funding, doing the kind of work that we consider to be incredibly valuable, building practical skills, but also kind of life skills with young people who are often in quite tricky situations and quite tricky backgrounds, very often at risk of exclusion from school, maybe had some interaction with statutory authorities like the police and so on. So that kind of small grant has helped Handy Trust, help turn around the lives of some of those young people. New Forest CAB, funded by us a couple of years ago through the Charles Burnett Fund. So I think often I find with CABs, a lot of people know CAB, but don't realise that they are very small, locally registered organisations and are having to fundraise for themselves. So they really run, I mean, literally on the smell of an oily rag. And by far the bulk of the support that is delivered through Citizens Advice is from volunteers. So we gave them a grant of 20,000 to help them develop work to work more effectively in partnership with other organisations. And a good example of that is, if you know, the Nederman Centre over in New Milton. So part of this funding helped them set up days at the Nederman, which coincided with New Forest Basic Spank turning up with the lorry, and enabling various organisations to offer their services to the people who are using the pantry, the mobile pantry going out to the Nederman in New Milton. And that kind of thing can be absolutely transformative, because people who are really facing those challenging situations of, let's say, debt, worried that they're, maybe receiving a notification that they're being evicted and don't have access to the internet because they don't necessarily have the skills or can't afford the Wi-Fi. Bringing all of those services together in one place gives people the opportunity to learn about those services and, the chance to start a conversation which could be really helping them turn around, what's obviously going to be a very difficult time for them. And of course, particularly in the New Forest, it's a problem all around a fairly rural county like Hampshire, but particularly in the New Forest, being able to put all of your services in one place at one time, or a group of services in one place at one time, can be a fantastic multiplier, because so many people find public transport problematic, particularly if you're outside of the towns. And in fact, a lot of the services aren't replicated in each of the towns, as I'm sure you all know. And then one of the bigger charities that we've supported recently, and many of you will know, is Minstead, up in Minstead. And Minstead are an incredible organisation advocating for people with learning disabilities. And we've had various different grants with them recently, where they're either doing very direct support for people with learning disabilities, literally assisting an individual to access employment or training, and then supporting them when they're in the employment or training. But they're also working to advocate with local employers for how they might be able to employ people with learning disabilities in their workforce. So really incredible organisation. And they've received various different grants from us over the last couple of years. If you've ever been to Portsmouth Library, the cafe in Portsmouth Library, Lily and Lime is run by people with learning disabilities, supported by Minstead. So really quickly, I'm just going to give you a picture of how companies support Hampshire and Isle of Wight Community Foundation. And there's two main ways that companies support us, but it's really their community that they're supporting through us. One is that they fund their own grant programs. A really good example of that is Money Barn, and that's when there's a substantial amount of money available right now that you want to do something with right now. And so normally these kind of programs is, you know, they're substantial grants, it's 50,000 or more. And then we work with that company to identify what it is that they want to do and help them identify who would be able to do that in the local community most effectively. And then the other main option is endowment donations. And so that's often something that a company or an individual running a company might think about doing when they're selling the company, if they're being taken over and there's a significant bit of investment available, or not investment available, but capital being released from selling the property, selling the company, for example. And that sort of donation, the idea of that is we hold it in perpetuity. So it's a donation to us, we hold it in perpetuity, but we make grants according to the wishes of that original donor. And that's where that 15 million pounds that I mentioned earlier has come from, is endowment donations from companies and individuals and so on. Now, there are lots of other things that different companies can consider equally for individuals or other types of potential donor. We give advice. So, for example, we, instead of running a grants program for an organization, if you're interested in just identifying a couple of charities working in a particular area, doing a particular thing, but you don't really know, you know, what you're looking for or how to ensure that you're, you know, looking at a grantee that is robust and is going to be able to do the right things with that money, we can give advice on that. And that's what we would charge for. That would always be dependent on the situation. Then we have what we call donor advised or invited funding. And again, that might be that, you know, there's a certain amount of money available, but you don't want to go out having a big grant program with advertising and so on. But we would still ensure that, you know, the underlying due diligence and ensuring that the grantee is a suitable grantee for what an organization wanted to achieve, is we would do all of those checks and balances. And then the last one, which is less common, but something that we're trying to promote a little bit more, is collective giving, which would be, for example, a group of businesses getting together saying, look, we know that in the long term we have an issue around the skills of our local population when we're recruiting our workforce. And so they might get together and say, okay, you know, I'm Joe Blogg's business, I can afford £1,000. I'm John Smith business, I can afford £10,000. I'm Millie Smith, and we can put in £50,000, and creating a fund which builds up over time, and that we then look after and look for grantee organizations who would be delivering what that cluster of organizations or people want to see changed. I use the example of employability because we've done a lot of work around employability and skills in recent times, and we know that employers locally, Hampshire, Portsmouth, Southampton, Isle of Wight, are really facing issues with having to recruit staff from outside of the area because of the way the flow of talent is working or not working, and that there are pockets of areas where school outcomes are very poor. So we're really keen on developing that particular area of our work. So that's a little bit of an overview. I hope it gives you a bit of a picture of what we do, how we deliver it through community groups, and how different companies can and have supported us in the past. So I'm going to stop sharing now and give you the chance to ask any questions. But for the recording, I'm just going to let you have the contact information screen so that anybody looking at this can easily pick up the contact information. So I'm going to stop sharing now. And I can see you all again now. Just want to open the floor for questions. I have no idea, Matthew, if I've gone massively over time or not.
You are 4 minutes under. No, thanks so much, Jackie. Lots to think about there, and certainly some areas I hadn't quite realized, and that's quite useful for us if we get asked if there is such an organization, particularly that whole idea of somebody who can manage grant making for you. to put it simply. So no, that's very interesting, and yeah, lots to think about. So do you only work with charities or about not-for-profits or community interest companies?
Yeah, we go the whole gamut. So as long as it is legally defined as charitable, we are allowed to fund it. We're not allowed to fund something that isn't legally defined as charitable. There's a little bit of grey around that, as you can imagine. But yeah, we do commonly fund CICs and so on. What we are very hot on is ensuring that the structure of an individual organisation is appropriate to fund. So CICs in particular, because they can pay their directors, we often have trickiness around that. If there isn't, we request or require a minimum of 3 directors, unrelated and not living at the same address. So it can't be parent and stepchild, for example, who are the unrelated directors, because it's reducing any risk there.
We've when we're looking for funding for NFBP, which is a community interest company, there are
Yeah.
2 kinds of community interests, and we're the one where none of us as shareholders get any benefit from it.
Good.
So
And you have an asset lock, I would think.
Yeah, we do.
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we also have a charity nominated were we ever to.
Yeah, that's your asset lock. Yeah, nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. And actually that's really good to see. And it's a difficult structure, CICs, because in many cases the directors are also the employees. And so we like to see where it's been carefully thought through at the start.
Yeah. But no, it is a challenge because there are a number of businesses in the forest, some larger ones, some well-known ones that might fund us, but when we go to them, because we're not a charity, and one of the boxes straight away is a charity registration number.
Right. So what you can recommend to those businesses is to fund us.
Yeah.
And I know that sounds like I'm saying get them to give the money to us, but we have a lot more expertise in most cases than those companies would in terms of doing all of the due diligence on an organization. And they can say, look, we're interested in funding NFBP, but we're just not sure and it doesn't quite fit within our structures. We will fit within their structures, and we can negotiate with them on how to make that work for them in a way that's appropriate. And the reassurance of the due diligence, right? Because we go into a company's house and we go into the charity commission and so on.
Yeah. Interesting.
But to answer your initial question, we'll fund sports associations, CICs, CIOs, and so on. As long as they meet the remainder of the due diligence requirements, we can fund them.
So you would fund an association if it looked right, if it had a robust constitution and so forth?
Exactly. Yep. We do quite a lot in sports because that's where most associations are. We do quite a lot of funding around sports, actually. And in fact, I would say that we're a bit undercooked in the New Forest for sports and physical activity, which is interesting, isn't it? When you think it's so obviously that there's so much you can do, there's really big barriers for participation in the forest for sport and physical activity. A lot of it's transport, but a lot of it is money, because the stuff that is available is, pricey. Yeah.
Yeah.
Astrid.
Really interesting, Jackie. Thank you very much indeed. I've done a lot of work with the voluntary sector in the past few, probably 15 or so years. One of the things in other lives, but recently I do a bit of training in governance for trustees.
More.
Yeah, so that they don't keep cocking it up quite as badly as they used to when I was donating to them. How can I access a small amount of information about your foundation so that when I go and train for Community First, which I do all over Hampshire and the island, and Community First and then Community Action on the island.
Oh, good. I knew I recognized your name, Astrid. The pennies just dropped, because you're doing something with community action at the moment, aren't you? I saw your great.
Yeah. Well, I'm hoping to, but we're rescheduling, I think. Anyway, but what I'd like is to be able to put a form of words in my training. I'm guessing that's not from you, but is there some way, if we link via LinkedIn afterwards, can you point someone in my direction just to give me a form of words that I can read out, that I make sure is in the workbooks, so that all these guys know that this is how they can keep themselves on the straight and narrow funding wise?
Yeah, I'll ask my colleague Joanne to send you something.
Cool.
I always say as well that because we are a community-based funder, if you can't access your funding through us, you're not going to access it from anybody. National, big lottery isn't going to look at you. If you can't get through our hoops, you're not going to get through anybody's.
Indeed.
Indeed. You might get through the hoops that the local co-op give you, but that's completely different. If you're looking at growing your organization, if you can't get through community foundation hoops, you won't get through anybody else either. So let me ask my colleague Joanne to drop you something on that.
Yeah, great. It's just I need a paragraph that has come from you that I can say to people, if you have any queries about funding and you want to access funding, or you're a CIC and you're failing the tick box test that Matthew identified with, because I have come across that, then just say, these are the people, and then it goes in the workbooks that I issue, and then they've got it in writing and they've got a thing.
Yep. Nice one. Thanks, Astrid.
Well, thank you.
Rob.
The topics of poverty and inequality are fairly broad ones. Are there any particular subsections within those areas that you think are particularly worthy of attention at the moment?
You're right, they are very broad, deliberately so. And partly the reason they are deliberately that way is that we want local communities to identify what matters to them. We don't want to say, now, you must remember this is the most important thing, because it might not be. And, I as your middle-class, middle-aged white woman in leafy Leamington shouldn't be the person telling them that. It's a bit uncool, but it's also just not really good practice. And we are really keen on hearing from local communities about the specific things that matter to them. Having said that, the things that we have been funding recently, particularly around poverty, is a lot of direct poverty alleviation. So food banks, basics banks, and so on. And I think the reasons are obvious. I think the big thing around that is that, the public mindset can move away from it, because they think that, well, inflation today was announced at being, was it 2.4% today? And that, well, that's not so bad, cost of living crisis is over. Of course it isn't. That's 2.4% on, 11% a year and a half ago.
Yes.
So yeah. So, and if your income hasn't shifted by that, you are deeper, more in deeper poverty. In terms of inequality, it is a broad term, and it's a broad theme, that part of it. And again, deliberately so. I think what we're interested in this area, the whole area, Hampshire, Portsmouth, Southampton, Isle of Wight, is certainly looking at, I always say, think of your protected characteristics. So we are always interested in work that's been generated by non-British white ethnicities, LGBTQ, and so on. And where we are doing funding on that, it's often quite niche, and it's often the only organisation that's doing that kind of stuff. Funnily enough, in terms of stuff where it's minority ethnic groups, recently that's often been things like Ukrainians, Afghanistanis, and so on, rather than what you might imagine in Portsmouth, where there's a big African and African Caribbean population, although we have done some sort of funding like that. So, but also it's about not presuming that because you're from a protected characteristic group that you're therefore unequal or experiencing life unequally. I would always say my best friend is British-born Sri Lankan. She's way more middle class than I am. She doesn't need the support of a charity. So just because she's brown doesn't mean that she's necessarily living that life. But having said that, we also know that there's common experience there. So, but really the bottom line is that it's about meeting the needs of local communities as they've identified it. But I also want to say that it can be quite hard for community groups, because if you're a community group that's been founded to work with young people with autism because you've got a child who's autistic and the various groups around you couldn't support your child and couldn't fulfill their needs as you were bringing that young person up, your interest is about young people with autism. And that, you know, all of those other kind of things, they massively impact. You know, if you come from an ethnic group that doesn't recognize mental ill health, I'm not sure if that's quite what we would describe with autism, but, you know, that doesn't recognize that kind of condition, or you have an autistic young person who's also gender questioning and so on, those community groups, I can tell you right now, they're finding it very difficult to face those really complex needs. And also, we, as with almost every other main funder, is going to be saying what's the key criteria you're looking at in terms of your protected characteristics. So they'll take, you know, people with disabilities. They might not necessarily say, oh, and 10 of these kids are kids who have come from, you know, different ethnic groups or gender questioning or whatever. So it's a really tricky one. It's not, there's no simple answer to that, but we want it to be driven by the communities and how they're working with the client groups that they have, and also how they're reaching the client groups that they're not reaching.